I also have a book called Essential Math for Games and Interactive Applications, which you can find downstairs during the expo. My talk today is called Doing Math with RGB and A Correctly. The source for this talk was, I've been working in graphics since around 1989. I knew some of the subjects of this talk, but I never really had to deal with these issues until I started working on 2D math. 2D graphics, which was kind of surprising to me. So I just wanted to share some of the things that I've learned in the last 2 years and things that I should have known before. So my topics today are going to be, I'm going to start off by talking about color spaces, because when we're talking about color, we need to talk about how we're representing that color. I'll talk about gamut, which is part of how much color we can represent in a color space. And then the meat of the talk is, the math meat of the talk is talking about gamma correction, and then pre-multiplied alpha, which is alpha, not color. So we talk about representing color. One possibility is just to represent color as just a spectrum. So a series of wavelengths and amplitudes. And a lot of the high-end graphic packages do this. So like ray tracers, for example. But this is generally overkill for games, and it's not what we use. What we do instead is we talk about color in terms of how we perceive it. In particular, how the average observer perceives color. And so this allows us to reduce our problem considerably. So when we talk about the average eye, we have different responses to different wavelengths of color depending on the three color detector cells, the cones in the eye. And you can see there's the sort of approximation of the curves of response there. You note that we don't respond very well to blue, but red and green we respond very strongly. I will just point out, in my researches I discovered that there are other cells in the eye. Some people, mostly women as I understand it, have a fourth color detecting cell. And then there's another kind of cell which was recently discovered, which responds to changes in brightness. And it has its response is mostly towards the blue-violet end of the spectrum. But we're just going to consider three main color detecting cells. And here's a map of the normalized response. So we just sort of mapped everything so they go from 0 to 1. And you can see that when we say red, we actually mean somewhere between green and yellow, which is kind of not really very red. And then blue is actually a little more violet. For this reason, they're called short, medium, and long responses. But we'll just continue calling them RGB. So in our case, we're going to try to represent color with some sort of these three different signals. And so we're going to have a red signal, a green signal, and a blue signal. And then we're going to scale them and do a weighted sum. And this is just a vector space. So our basis for the vector space are the three curves that we see here. And our coordinates, our components, are just the RGB values. So we can just draw it as a vector space like this, and then there's a point in the vector space that represents, it's an affine space that represents the color. So one thing to note is that on a physical device, little r, g, and b can't be more than 1. You can't make a device brighter than the brightest thing it can produce. Similarly, it can't be less than 0 because once it's off, it's off. You can't get more than off. So you end up with a color cube like this. And this is for a given set of primaries, or basically our basis vectors. You get a certain cube of colors out of your affine space. Now, what primaries do we choose? What are we using here? And depending on what the primaries we use, we can represent a certain subset of the colors that the average observer can perceive. So to define that a little better, this is the CIE XYZ color space. And this represents all of the colors that the average observer can perceive. So this sort of weird cone-like shape is all of those colors. And these, why don't we use these? Well, they're not really physical, representable things. We can't build a device that generates these signals. Y is roughly is luminance, so you can think of that roughly as brightness. Z is roughly the blue-violet response, and X is sort of the red-green normalized to keep everything positive. So if we take a slice through this and only consider, wow, that is really desaturated. We only consider the most saturated colors, except on this display here, apparently. Then we get a shape like this. And around the edge, those are the pure wavelengths of light. So we kind of go from pure blue all the way back to pure red on the other side of the curve. And within that, I've shown a triangle. And this is the triangle that we can represent with our standard color space, which is sRGB, S being standard. You will often see this diagram with color all the way up to the edges of this weird horseshoe shape. And it bothers me when they do that, because you can't represent all of that. You can't represent that in print media. You can't represent that generally. Actually, I can't think. You can't represent it in display media. So just remember, they're lying to you when they're doing that. What I'm showing here in this triangle is what I can actually represent in color, because I'm using sRGB. A bit of the history of sRGB. It was created by Microsoft and HP back in the 90s. The situation was that there were a lot of different standards out there, and every image would store its color profile along with it, so that, one system you'd work, it would have its color profile, it'd store the color profile in the image, so when you move to another system, you could say, oh, here's the color profile you're working in, I have a different color profile, I need to do some kind of translation. That was both made the image much bigger and took time to do that conversion. So Microsoft and HP said, look, let's just have one standard. This is in the early days of the web. We'll have one standard. We'll keep our images small, so when we send them across the web, we don't have to include this extra profile information. And now it's the de facto standard for everything. It's the de facto minimum standard for everything, I should say. Now, of course, there are other standards. Here's the triangle for the Adobe RGB. So there are more than one RGB standard out there. This is primarily used by professional photographers. I think there's a Pro Photo RGB as well. And just to show an example, there are plenty of other color spaces as well. The ones I've been talking about are just RGB, but there's CMYK, which is the color standard for printers. This is not an additive, it's a subtractive, since you're laying ink on a white page as opposed to brightening up a dark surface. You notice that with CMYK, you're going to chop off the corners of our sRGB triangle, which is why you can't quite get the same colors when you print it as when you have on your display. So let's go back to talking about our gamut, which is the representation of colors that we can represent with our current color space, in which case is sRGB. And I've represented the triangle in the previous diagram as those dotted lines. So this does raise a question. What happens if we end up with values for RGB outside 0 or 1. Not often out of 0, but we can often end up with values bigger than 1. So if we think about the possible lighting conditions we might run into, for example, we could go from something like starlight, or we can go from something like full sunlight, which I suppose is a different kind of starlight, just the star is much closer. It is. But we can't represent all of those values on our screen. We're limited by both the color space we're representing it with and with what the screen can actually display. So we need to get those values back into something that we can actually present. So the sort of hacky standard method is just to take anything greater than 1 and clamp it off. And this is represented by this graph here. The red line is just gets clamped off. And this works for, some applications, but it probably won't give you the result that you want. Another is to compute the maximum values for RGB across the scene and then scale all of the colors so that you're back down into the 0 to 1. And the red curve there on the right represents that. So we look at that. I just have a couple of black and white images here just to emphasize the luminance. In the clamp mode here, we see that we represent our low-level values pretty well, but then once we get high, everything's just really bright. Whereas with the scale, everything just kind of gets mushed together in the same scale. It looks pretty good, but we're losing a little bit of definition. But the standard method in games is to use tone mapping. And there are lots of different ways of doing tone mapping, but the standard method is you analyze your entire scene to get what's called a log average luminance, or just kind of think of it as an average brightness value. And then you use that as a key, and you scale all of your values so that your key lays at some medium brightness. And then you still might have values that are out of range, so then you apply this curve here to get them all into range. And this is effectively like a virtual iris. So, the dimmer your scene is, it'll emphasize the dimmer values, and the brighter the scene is, it'll emphasize the brighter values. And so with my image, I end up with a tone map image like this. So, kind of just to sum up all of this discussion, in order to handle values that happen outside our gamut, we need to make decisions how to shift them back. Probably for most of you, this is not going to be an issue. Somebody's working on the tone mapping algorithm, and it may or may not be you, but in most cases, it's not you. But it's just something to keep in mind. The other thing we need to talk about is, I've said we have the RGB values, and they range from 0 to 1, but I haven't talked about, in the computer, we have to represent them somehow. And the standard representation has been for a while, is to use 8-bit values for each of these channels. So we represent them from values from 0 to 255, where 255 means 1. One thing about this is known as true color with the RGB values. And it does give you billions of values, but as we saw before, those billions of values lie within that little tiny triangle. So even though we can perceive billions of colors, and this gives us billions of colors, they're not the same colors. So true color is really kind of a misnomer. Now, this is kind of a weird format. The difference between each value is 1 over 255, which we can't represent exactly in floating point or in fixed point values. It's actually, the prime factors are 3, 5, and 17. So it's a little strange. And an example of the strangeness here is we can't represent 1/2. So we can represent things to the other side, but we can't represent 1/2 exactly. There are some systems that do assume that 127 or 128 equals 1/2, but then you're kind of mushing one side or the other of your range. So something to keep in mind. I actually ran into this. I do some work with signed distance fields, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And I wanted to represent 1/2 as sort of the edge of something. Couldn't do it because I couldn't represent 1/2 exactly. The other option is to use floating point. Either signal precision floating point, which is 32 bits, or half precision, usually, which is 16 bits. And this does give us much broader range, and we can represent 1/2, which is nice, and other values like that. The downside, of course, is that they take up more space, and hence they take up more memory traffic to shuttle them back and forth to the GPU. They can be slower on some platforms, especially mobile platforms, and not all the features can be supported. So a lot of mobile platforms don't allow you to write images in floating point. But if you got them, you can afford the space and the time, it is a great solution. All right. So the next topic is gamma correction. And in order to explain this, I again need to go back in history a bit. So put on your flannels and drink your lattes. We are going back to the 1990s here. Well, probably before that. Back around then, the primary displays were CRTs. And they have a rather odd response to voltages. At small vantage voltage, you get a slight change in brightness. And then at higher ranges of voltage, that slight change produces more of a change in response. So the curve is like this. It's roughly quadratic, and it's an exponential curve. You can have it as input to some gamma value. Hence, it's called the gamma curve for a particular monitor. And the sort of standard gamma is 2.2, which is why I say it's roughly quadratic. Now, the problem with this is we want our color values to behave linearly. So if we stick in a color value, we want it to grow, the brightness to grow as the color value grows. So to handle this, we need to correct our color values by gamma correction. So we apply the inverse curve to our color values. Then when we feed it to the monitor, it'll respond in a linear fashion in the end. Now, having said all this, why do we do this at all? As I said, we don't really use CRTs anymore, mostly LCDs. And why couldn't we just sort of create hardware that responds linearly to a linear signal? Well, there are advantages to gamma correction. If we look at that gamma-corrected color value, and we look at a curve, which is roughly our perceptual response to brightness, you see they're about the same. Actually, I'm cheating here. They're exactly the same, because I couldn't find the perceptual curve. But they're roughly the same. Our eyes are very sensitive to changes in dark values, and not as sensitive to changes in brighter values. So by storing our color values in this curve, we're effectively compressing them to match our color perception, our brightness perception. So that's a really nice advantage there. We're saving bits. So how does this work in practice? So artists, are there any artists here? Are we all programmers? Some artists, okay. Represent. We'll create, they're going to create their data using sRGB, using their sRGB monitor, using their sRGB. They're going to store it in sRGB. And then it's going to have that gamma-corrected curve for sRGB. And then we'll just feed it to the display. The display will do the inverse correction, and we'll get the right result. The problem is that what happens if we want to do math in between? on those gamma corrected values. So for example, suppose we want to do some lighting. Our lighting values are physical, so they're going to be linear. If we apply those linear values to our nonlinear gamma corrected images, we're not going to get the right results because they're not in the same space. Another example, suppose we have two textures and we want to blend them together. Again, they're both nonlinear, and they're going to have, if we do that, we're not going to get the right result because blending is a linear operation. So what we have to do is take our sRGB, the gamma correction, convert it to a linear space, do our math, and then convert it back to sRGB and write it out. So this does raise a question. This seems like a lot of work. Why don't we just read in our data, store it linearly, do everything linearly, don't worry about any of this, and then at the very end, just write it out as sRGB. Hey, it actually turned up correctly this time. I'll explain that in a second. This could work, but when we take our sRGB values, if we're using 8-bit color, we're going to lose a lot of precision. So the top line is sRGB values, and using that curve, I convert to linear, and you see it's pretty much just flat. We've lost a lot of information, and so we're going to get a lot of blockiness. Ideally, you need 13 bits of precision to represent that same 8-bit curve in sRGB. So if you want to store things linearly, you need to use, you can probably get away with 12-bit color, but probably 16-bit is easier to deal with. However, if you do that, then you're wasting space at the other end. So here's my sRGB values, but when I convert it to linear, then I have huge gaps between my linear values. And so I'm basically wasting bits here, representing those values. But if you've got the space, I mean, you can use a 13-bit value or a 12-bit value to store this, and you can be okay. But in general, if you're constrained to 8-bit color, which you might be like on a mobile device, just to save space, it's better just to keep your storage formatted sRGB and do the conversions back and forth. So let me just show some effects of doing gamma correction on lighting. So first let me say I love this projector because the black value is just a little bit too low. So it really shows this off. This is much darker than it should be, so it really shows off this effect. So on the left side here I have a non-corrected image. So I just took linear values, lit a sphere, and just fed them directly to the display. And you can see you end up with values that are much too dark here. We should see a nice clear terminator for the shadow, which we can see on the right side in the corrected value. Here's an example just kind of showing blending with the same result. These are just two spotlights on that same sphere. And on the right side, you can see that where they don't overlap, it looks a little too dim. And hence, where they overlap, it looks really bright. And the right side, when they're corrected, they get the right brightness, and so that overlap, it looks better. One thing about this image is that I just clamped it. So if I actually use a tone mapping, it might look better still. So this is the process we're stuck with. Now, fortunately, on most hardware, again, some mobile devices don't support this, most hardware will do this conversion for you. So you can say, this texture is sRGB, so when you read from it, it'll say, oh, I'm going to convert to a linear value, do your math, read a linear value, and then when you write it back out, you can say what you're writing to is sRGB, and I'll take that linear value and convert it for you. So in general, you don't have to worry about this process. Just make sure that this is enabled in your hardware. And that's supported in both OpenGL and DirectX. Okay, so moving on to alpha. And this is the other element we often use with color. And this is the one that I've probably learned the most working with 2D graphics. Because this is the things I'm talking about, they come up with 3D, but not quite as often. So usually when we think of alpha, we think of it as meaning transparency, or more strictly opacity. So in this interpretation, if we look at a pixel, then the color fills that pixel with, say, an opacity value, in this case of 50%. So this is a pure red with a 50% transparency. Sorry, 50% opacity. It's the same for 50%. And the standard alpha transparency formula is this. So just to explain the terminology here, the capital C's are RGB values, so that's kind of the color. Alpha S is the alpha value for the source color. That's the one we're putting on top. So this is blending between our destination, which is CD, and our source using this formula. Now there's another interpretation for alpha, and that is coverage. So for example, in anti-aliasing, so this is why I say in 2D, this is where this comes up. If you have some 2D shape and you want to have a nice sharp edge, you have to worry about the coverage of the pixel for that 2D shape. And so in this case, we have our box that's pure red, and the edge is hitting a pixel halfway. So we have 50% coverage. And so our alpha value, again, is going to be 50% or 1/2. So a more accurate way of thinking about alpha is more like, what is the contribution of this color to the final pixel value? Whether we think of it as opacity, whether we think of it as coverage, the result is the same. We're contributing 50% of our color to this pixel. So the way that alpha is most used in games is it's just thrown on as an additional channel. So with, you've got your RGB and just throw on your alpha and it acts like opacity. However, it is far better to pre-multiply your RGB values by that alpha. And this is called pre-multiplied alpha. If you do that, then you end up with this blending equation. And this works for both transparency and for opacity and for coverage. And this is called source over. And using that name, it makes a little more intuitive sense. We have some destination and we're placing the source over it. If it's opaque or it's got full coverage, it just covers it. And if it's transparent or it has, it's a little bit of coverage, then we're only covering a little bit of that destination. So note here that both the destination color and the source color have been pre-multiplied by their alphas, and we've sort of dropped that alpha source value. Now, if our destination color has transparency, this will actually give us a slightly different result than a traditional method. But the result will be more correct. Okay, so why do we want to do this? Well, one example is that it gives us a few more blending effects that we can use. These are known as the Porter-Duff modes, Porter-Duff compositing modes, so named after the writers of the paper that introduced alpha. And this is nice because you can do some more effects with your UI, some overlaid effects, and giving your artist more options is always a nice thing. But even if all you're doing is standard alpha transparency, pre-multiplied alpha is a win. So bear with me, this is a bit of a strained example, but suppose we have some texture and it's got a solid red pixel and it's got a transparent green texel right next to it. And suppose that we draw this texture so that the red lies on half of a pixel and the transparent green lies on the other half of a pixel. And we want to know what's our result here. I'm just going to point out that these are not pre-multiplied. So the result we'd expect would we do a 50-50 blend of them. So we just average the two values, and we end up with the result on the bottom there. And we end up with this sort of olive green, weird olive green color, which is not what we expect. We'd expect something a little more red because the green is pretty much transparent. However, if we use pre-multiplied alpha, then we get the correct result. So notice that the green value on the top there, the G has been multiplied by 1 over 20. It's been multiplied by the alpha. So then when we do our 50-50 blend on the bottom, we end up with that red value. So basically, multiplying by the alpha lowers that green contribution so we can get the right result. Now, as I said, this may seem like a rather strange example. Why, what artist would ever create anything like this? But we can still end up with this situation with a more reasonable example. Suppose we have a leaf texture, and we start with a black background, which is transparent, and we paint an opaque leaf on top of it. So we have a green texel and a black texel next to it. And we render this on a red background. If we use the standard alpha transparency model, then we end up with this result, which looks way too dark. And again, we're adding too much contribution from the black from this. Whereas if we use pre-multiplied alpha, then we get something closer. I'll say it looks a little better on my screen, but we end up with something that's halfway in between. Finally, and this trick comes from Tom Forsyth's blog. I think it's pretty neat. There's one more thing we can do with pre-multiplied alpha, which is pretty cool. Suppose we have a color with a 0 alpha channel. And normally, everything would be 0 in this because we're multiplying by alpha. Well, we're just going to say, no, we're going to set these things that should be 0 to some color. So here I have a red pre-multiplied alpha color with 0 transparency. And if we apply our source over equation, we end up with something like this. And so our alpha is 0, so that 1 minus alpha source goes away. And then I've changed it to a C star because it's not really alpha source times the color source. It's we get additive blending out of this. So we get our destination, we just add a source color to it. So what this means is we can combine transparency and additive in one call. We can use the same shader, the same blend mode, and have different kinds of things in our world that are additive and transparent. What kind of things am I talking about? Well, like particles. So, for example, if you have some fire particles, you could start off with them being additive, so they will add brightness to the little bright specks to the screen. And as those particles decay and turn into soot, they become more and more transparent. So you get kind of a sooty cloud as it goes away. And in this case, we don't have to separate them out and render these guys are additive, these guys are transparent. We can do it all in one call. And it's easy and fast. One more thing about pre-multiplied alpha. If you're doing this gamma stuff, the gamma correction, you have to be sure to do the conversion to the pre-multiplied version, not to the standard, not to the RGB, and then do the pre-multiplied. The reason is that, when would this come up? So you have, again, some texture or something that an artist has created with transparency in it. You will convert that to linear, do the multiplication, and then convert to sRGB to be stored and used in your game. So what happens is when you convert from the sRGB gamma to linear, you'll get R times A, G times A, B times A, as you expect. The other thing to note here is that alpha, you don't apply the gamma correction to alpha. Alpha is always a linear value. So, summing up, I've had this calculator for a very long time, I must say. Be careful of out of gamut issues. So if you need to, do some sort of tone mapping. Be aware of gamma correction and handle any conversions if you're doing math with your colors. And use pre-multiplied alpha. It is awesome. So some quick references if you're interested more about color spaces and gamma and luminance and standards. Charles Poynton has a color fac out there. Pretty much search for Charles Poynton and color and you'll find all sorts of interesting things about that. The paper that introduced alpha is by Porter and Duff, and it's called Compositing Digital Images. And then finally, Tom Forsyth's blog has a nice article about pre-multiplied alpha. So again, if you search for Tom Forsyth and pre-multiplied alpha, you'll find that. He also has some discussion about pre-multiplied alpha and compressing textures. I didn't want to get into that too much because he's talking about some older compression standards, but you might want to look at that just to be sure. And that is it. Are there any questions? Yes?
You mentioned that you did the color blending without using the pre-multiplied output, and you got basically just the wrong color blending. Intuitively, why is that the case?
So the question is, when I did the color blending with the non-pre-multiplied alpha, I got the wrong color. And intuitively, why is that the case? Well, what's happening is by pre-multiplying, you are saying that is the contribution of that color to the pixel. So if I say I have a red color with a half alpha, that if I pre-multiply, I'm basically baking in that red color is contributing half to the pixel. And if I don't do that, then I get too much. Anything else? Yes?
At which point in the content pipeline should the pre-multiplication?
I'm sorry, I can't.
At which point of the content pipeline
Yes?
the pre-multiplication should take place?
So the question is, which point of the content pipeline should the pre-multiplication take place? Well, I would do it in your tools. You're probably going to do some sort of conversion of your textures and other data at that point. So you can do the pre-multiplication there. So your colors will come in pre-multiplied. Yeah, that's probably where I would do it. Yes?
What if you have alpha from the texture plus contextual alpha based on something fading out? Like how would multiple alphas combine at different stages and when what has to multiply?
Okay, this question is, what happens if you have alpha? So for example, if something's fading out and you're using that with a texture that has, or some other color that has alpha in it, I think all you have to do is just multiply by that alpha. I mean, it's just an additional scale. So, yes?
There's been a shift to move the art pipeline to a linear rendering content.
Okay.
So at the end of that pipeline, we want it to go back to the sRGB.
Okay. I'm not aware of this, but your question is basically, it's a statement and a question. The statement is, there's a shift towards doing the pipeline in linear space. And the question is whether you should convert it to sRGB when you're done with that. Yeah. When it comes out of the pipeline, should you convert it to sRGB? I think it would depend on how you represent, like if you're doing it in 8-bit, I would say you should start in sRGB because of the perceptual issues I talked about before. If you're using floating point, or say, a bigger fixed point like 16, I'm actually not sure. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Yes?
I just wanted to mention something about sRGB and blending.
Yes.
You mentioned that some hardware doesn't have sRGB. I think it is pretty ubiquitous, but that it's not correct to blend two sRGB values together. So bilinear filtering in a texture is the linear operation.
Yes.
So if you put sRGB data into a texture and don't tell the hardware that it's sRGB, then you're bilinear filtering.
Right. So
You do actually need more to do that.
So there are two comments. One is that sRGB conversion is mostly ubiquitous. I disagree with that. I work with a lot of mobile devices that do not support sRGB conversion. But those are much older devices. The newer ones do support. So like ES 3.0, sRGB is in there. And then the comment is, if you don't indicate that those textures are sRGB, but they're stored as sRGB, they're created as sRGB, then you'll get the wrong blend because it'll try to do a linear blend on two sRGB things. Is that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you over there.
I said, if you do a linear filter on sRGB data in linear space and then try and do the linearization in the shader, that will work.
Okay. Anything else? Yes. Sorry.
I completely agree with you that we should do the creation in linear space. But I think artists may be thinking gamma ways. For example, in Photoshop, when artists blend two images, they blend in the gamma space, and they think that's right. What's your point about this?
So his point is that as a programmer, he thinks we should do blending in linear space. But the artists do their blending in sRGB space because that's what Photoshop gives them. But it sounds like artists are starting to do more blending in linear space. So it sounds like the artists are starting to agree with us that that is correct. Yes?
I noticed in one of your examples, you had alpha being a measure of transparency when you had it seemed like rotating had an alpha value of 0 while you were talking about the pre-multiplied alpha.
Yes.
Was that like, so is that true? Like, where you're doing that, would I be using alpha where 1 is transparent and 0 is opaque? Or is that, or am I right in being this like, the other way around?
If I go back, which?
It was right there. The next one, right there.
This one here.
Yeah, so is that
Okay.
like, a source value with the 0 alpha being fully opaque?
Yes, this is me using the pre-multiplied alpha math in a weird way. So basically, it's when you do this, you get an additive effect if you use it with the source over equation. So you end up with this, you're adding the RGB values rather than doing a blend. Well, you're doing a blend, but it's just an additive blend. All right, I think it's 11 o'clock. Is that our time? So, thank you.